Hello, I'm Gwen Eiffel, and this is the Washington Week Webcast Extra. I'm joined around the table by Peter Baker of the New York Times, Michael Duffy of Time Magazine, Karen Tumulty of the Washington Post, and Jeff Zeleny of ABC News, ABC News. We asked for your questions this holiday week and answered a bunch of them in the main show, but we have just a few more for the web. From Ken, all Americans need health care, he said. Sent us this by Facebook. Can't we just skip Obamacare and go directly to single-payer national health care? I think we've heard this question before, Michael.
Well, you know, there are those who would have preferred that as the option at the beginning, both this round and 15 years ago.
Including many Democrats, mostly Democrats.
Absolutely. But because so many Americans already have health insurance and because this president and his allies in the Democratic Party thought it was best to use the existing private insurance market and leave it in place and build on that using a combination of public approach and market forces, they created something that's a hybrid. And that, you know, a lot of people think maybe now, given whatever startup problems there are, we should go to the single payer. But the politics at the moment aren't toward a single payer. They're kind of away from that. So whatever logic you might see in one system over another, the politics at the moment really argue for leaving this hybrid thing in place and just trying to make that work.
Yeah. It turns out Americans are paying attention to even the most arcane debates here in Washington, including the debt limit. Remember that? Let's take a listen.
Why is there no debt limit? I am a 17-year-old. Next year I'll be able to vote. And my generation is going to have to pay for the amount of debt that this generation is wasting.
That's a real frustration.
Yeah, no, it really does. There is actually a debt limit, of course. The problem is that it keeps going up, and the most recent state is $17 trillion. It's going to be reached, they think, in June, and Zach and his generation will, in fact, be picking up a lot of the burden of that. And I think that that's underlying so much of the debate, this notion of generational redistribution, right, that we're passing along to the next generation.
And what he's actually saying is there ought to be less debt.
He thinks there ought to be a real limit that's less than what we're doing right now. And in fact, we're not coming down in debt, we're going up in debt. What we are, though, is coming down in the deficit, which is the annual difference between spending and taxation, and that will make the debt go up slower than it had been. That may be of small consolation to Zach, but over time, that will make a difference.
There is a popular theory out there that the reason for Washington dysfunction, I hear it all the time, is that it's not the fact of what's happening in Washington, but the fact that nobody ever leaves Washington. So let's listen to this question that came out of California.
Aren't two of our biggest flaws the fact that gerrymandering has gotten so extreme and the fact that lobbyists have so much power that our government is run basically on legalized bribery? And how can we fix these two problems?
Legalized bribery, Jeffrey?
I'm not sure about legalized bribery. That's certainly an opinion, and sometimes it may look like that from the outside. But look, I think he hit the nail on the head with the gerrymandering and how congressional seats are drawn, as we talked about in the show just a little bit ago. I mean, the lines are drawn to keep the same members of Congress in office. And it's not changing except in California.
Aren't those lines drawn on the state level? Is this really a federal government problem?
Well, I think it becomes both. I mean, the lines are drawn on the state level. That's one of the reasons that for all the, Republicans trying to figure out their brand in Washington, is the Republican Party, hit its peak? Not in the countries. Republicans are running state capitals, the majority of state legislatures, et cetera, and those are the lawmaking bodies that are drawing these lines. So I think that legalized bribery probably is a step too far, but there is a lot of money involved in politics. We're not going to see that changing. But the Obama administration this week has tried to make a small change in that, trying to switch the legal definition of what these not-for-profit groups can sort of do. We'll see if that actually has any impact on the next election here, but it certainly looks like that from the outside. Whether we would call it legalized bribery or not, it clearly isn't functioning well, and something at some point, the fever we keep talking about, needs to break.
But we're also becoming a more polarized country. The Senate is not subject to gerrymandering, and yet in the Senate you used to have liberal Republicans and you used to have conservative Democrats. those people have all essentially been wiped out. So
because of primaries, though, right? Which is sort of the same. I mean,
well, it's not entirely because of primaries. I mean, and again, you see, I believe, too, that the country itself has divided much more than it was in the past into two camps. So now the most liberal Republican in the Senate is more conservative than the most conservative Democrat. There used to be a lot of overlap.
Our states effectively have become gerrymandered districts. We tend to live near people who agree with us now. So if you're from New England, you're more likely to be Democratic. If you're from the South, you're more likely to be Republican.
Too.
And reinforced by your media. There's an interesting statistic I read in Politico magazine recently. It says that the number of density in a congressional district tells the story. If you live in a place with 800 people per square mile or above, you're more likely, 2/3 of the likely to be voting Democratic. If you live in a place with 800 or fewer per square mile, it's 2/3 likely to be Republican.
Politico magazine, a fine publication. I want to end with one more thing, which was a big deal this week in the last couple of weeks. 3 big developments on foreign policy in Iran, Afghanistan, and Syria. This is what the president had to say about that.
Some of you may recall that when I first ran for president, I said it was time for a new era of American leadership in the world. One that turned the page on a decade of war and began a new era of our engagement with the world. And as president and as commander-in-chief, I've done what I said. We ended the war in Iraq. We brought our troops home. Osama bin Laden met justice. The war in Afghanistan will end next year.
I've done what I said, the president said, which is really key, but we're not so certain, given what we've been watching this week, that the war in Afghanistan is going to end next year, that the peace in Syria will be brokered, or even that Iran will be free of nuclear weapons.
The gamble he's taking this week with Iran is perhaps one of the most dramatic of his presidency, particularly on foreign policy. He did say he was going to try to begin a new era of engagement, which meant talking not just to your allies, but to your enemies. Very controversial in the original 2008 campaign. Big dust-up between he and Hillary Clinton about this, and later with McCain. But really this week, this was the time we saw him actually lay that card on the table and say, I will not just talk to Iran, I will actually do a deal with it, reversible, verifiable, or all the things that they said it was going to be short-term, on a hunch that they will come along and be trustworthy. That's really something we haven't seen him do yet. This is the first high-stakes sort of acting out of that policy that he laid down 5 years ago.
We started the main program by talking about second-term itis, Peter. And I wonder if foreign policy issues aren't just the bane of the second term, and that that's what presidents want to get cleaned up. Those are the things they want to button up, but it seems elusive.
It does. Obviously, look, Iran might turn out to be a signal moment, and it might not. That's the problem. It is a temporary thing at the moment. The Syria deal right now, are we going to get rid of chemical weapons by teaming up with Russia? Seems like it's working at the moment, but you can see all sorts of possible pitfalls ahead where it doesn't. Look what happened with the Arab Spring, the Egyptian, revolution and counter-coup in effect. So many things can happen. Just a few days ago, we thought we had an agreement with Afghanistan to keep a small residual force there after the pullout of most troops in 2014, and then suddenly Karzai blows it up and says, well, wait a second, I'm not sure, I'm not going to sign it until after the spring. I'd like to have these more concessions. So every time I think a president feels like he gets someplace, something comes along to make him feel like it's kind of coming unraveled again.
It is frustrating, but thank you, everybody, for helping us to understand. Now you all get out there and shop until you drop, and we'll see you again on the next Washington Week Webcast Extra.